Cindy and I are here today to talk about a typical learning profile of someone with Down syndrome. We're not saying that everyone with Down syndrome learns the exact same way, but research has shown that this is a typical profile for someone with Down syndrome. What are some common strengths that teachers would see in someone with Down syndrome?
Children with Down syndrome are typically visual learners, and so when they're taking in things through their short-term memory, if they take it in visually, they learn by seeing, and they're more likely to hold on to that information. Children with Down syndrome are also better at reading typically than they are at math, and some of that goes back to being a visual learner. And also they have a strength that's social, empathy, and just social interactions. And even though that doesn't seem like an academic strength, it can be used in the classroom to foster motivation and academic success.
What about self-help skills and doing things for themselves?
I think that children with Down syndrome typically are good at self-help skills, and sometimes coupling that with motivations in the classroom and teaching them to be independent in the classroom goes along with the self-help skills.
How can a teacher use those strengths in the classroom to help them?
Elementary classrooms are typically set up to support visual learners, especially in early elementary. So just taking those typical things that you'd see in the classroom and using them throughout their education would probably maximize their learning potential, such as anchor charts with visual cues, using models, using gestures. If you're doing an activity that there are steps in a process, let's say the scientific process, giving them a visual cue for that process and chunking it into smaller visual steps as opposed to just letting them hear the information orally can be helpful. Also, it can give them a jump start on reading using sight words, giving them flashcards and teaching them sight words before you get into phonics and sounding things out will support them in their reading. And then when you do get to that phonics stage, supporting those letter sounds with gestures or symbols or even characters, depending on which program you're using, can help foster their learning and help speed it along in terms of remembering sounds, letters. In math, which is typically difficult for children with Down syndrome, if you provide models and also provide maybe manipulatives or some kind of tangible visual cue, it can help students in the classroom with Down syndrome. Using visual cues to help students integrate better into the classroom is also important, whether it's a visual calendar, whether it's a daily schedule that uses visual cues, can help students deal with anxiety. They may have heard what the schedule is going to be, but they may not retain it, and then they may have anxiety about what's going to happen next. So giving those visual cues can also help with independence because they can see what happens next and transition to the next activity more successfully.
You mentioned about social skills being a strength. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Sure. Social skills are something that children with Down syndrome typically have strength in, so that can include things like empathy or really wanting to develop those peer relationships, and that can be used as a motivator in the classroom for children with Down syndrome, such as partnering them with somebody and making them the peer model for somebody else, and also then having the other students be a peer model for them and using that peer pressure in a positive way to motivate students with Down syndrome to complete tasks or transition to new activities or just to integrate themselves into the classroom.
What are some typical weaknesses you may see in someone with Down syndrome?
Students with Down syndrome often have trouble processing information verbally, so their auditory processing may be slower. And ways that can be compensated in the classroom would be to slow down the steps that you're giving, to take advantage of the visual cues that are a strength and provide visual cues for the directions or the information, chunking information, and I think most importantly, providing wait time and letting students know when they're about to be called upon to share something or to answer a question. You can couple that with a visual cue, giving a student something tangible that says that they're going to be called on and having them hand that in after some wait time to make it a stronger connection between the visual, the wait time, and the difficulty with the auditory processing.
I always tell people that they can say, get your book bag, get your book bag, get your book bag, but they're still processing the first time you said it. So one of the things that I think is really important for us to remember is to give them wait time. So ask the question, give sufficient wait time, and then wait for them to process it.
And I think part of it too is the way you ask the question. If you're using as few words as possible, they're going to have less information to process. And so I'm not saying take the vocabulary and bring it down a notch, but use more word or less words, and they might be able to process it in a quicker way and retain it.
That also brings me to the point of not chunking information like you were saying, but breaking them down into smaller learning steps. So where you might tell someone to do 3 things at once, you might tell them to do one thing, then when they do that, then the next thing, and then the next thing, instead of overloading them with information.
Absolutely.
So how can a teacher accommodate for some of those weaknesses? You spoke a little bit about that.
Part of the problem with auditory processing is not just that they have trouble holding that information verbally into their short-term memory, but also a lot of children with Down syndrome do have hearing loss. It could be permanent hearing loss. It could be fluid in the ears due to the small tubes. So you want to compensate for that in some of the ways that we discussed, but also, again, pairing with the visual cue. If you're giving those directions, even if they're in small chunks, moving them from one picture to the next may help them take in that information. A lot of times, if there's a lot of background noise, they might have trouble. So seating and thinking about where the child is seated when they are processing that information might be helpful.
What about any other health concerns that they may have that may inhibit their learning?
Children with Down syndrome tend to have issues with their vision. It can be typical issues such as stigmatism, nearsightedness, farsightedness. But if you're relying on visual cues, you also need to be thinking about maybe the number of items on the page or how large the items are, because motor is a weakness for some children with Down syndrome as well. So if you're asking a student to count and you've got 100 tiny dots on a page, not only would they have trouble actually counting, because math is a weakness typically in children with Down syndrome, but they would have trouble seeing those and being able to then coordinate their motor and touching all those dots. So compensating by enlarging or less items in a page can help.
Are there any other health concerns that may inhibit their learning or keep them out of school?
Children with Down syndrome typically have smaller nasal passages and smaller eustachian tubes, so they're prone to sinus infections, ear infections, which may cause them to miss more school than typical children would, especially at the start as they're developing their immune systems. Children with Down syndrome can have, I think, maybe 60%, I think I heard, children with Down syndrome have some kind of heart defect, and so that can inhibit also.
I've heard a lot of parents say that fatigue is something that their child struggles with. They have to get a really good night's sleep in order for their behavior and things to be productive at school. They need to be well rested. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Children with Down syndrome, first of all, can have sleep apnea, and so that impacts how much rest they feel or how rested they feel even after what's considered a good amount of sleep. So that may impact them in the classroom. But something that people don't see, which I think is really important for teachers to know, is that children with Down syndrome often have low muscle tone, and that doesn't necessarily in the classroom mean that they're flopping around, but it could mean that it takes more energy to walk down the hallway to class, to specials, to lunch. It could mean that holding themselves upright on the carpet impacts how much energy they have to pay attention to the lesson that's happening. Sitting in a chair where their feet don't touch the floor, they're relying on that core strength. So they might fatigue during the day, not because they're being babyish or because they're tired from just being immature and not getting enough sleep. They're tired because it takes more energy to do those typical tasks. To write with a pencil, it takes more energy. I heard it's kind of like writing with gloves on your hand sometimes. The motor skills, writing with mittens and not being able to coordinate and just having to put more energy into that can help children fatigue during the day.